Welcome to this Friday afternoon live stream. Well, it's afternoon for me. I know it's night for many of y'all. Welcome for joining in. And I'm just going to wait a minute and make sure that the stream has caught up to the me. Hopefully, y'all had a great week, getting ready to wind down for the weekend, or maybe you're already in the weekend, and it looks like we are good to go. Fabulous. All right, let's get started. So today, a little bit of a different format. Sorry, I'm a little bit peaky. A little bit of a different format. I'm going to start with a talk that I prepared. And then at the end, we'll have lots of time for question and answers. So one sec, let me make sure I can see everybody in the chat. Let's get going. Today, we're going to talk about something that I've gotten a lot of questions about recently, which is measuring things. So particularly with I struggle to say non-deterministic system because once a Rasa chatbot is trained, the behavior is deterministic, but prior to training, it's not easy to tell what that deterministic behavior will be, right? So adding a machine learning component to things adds a degree of uncertainty and unpredictability that you don't have with rule-based systems. That doesn't mean the trained system is not going to be stable and predictable. It means that there are additional steps of evaluation that you need to take during your system development and deployment. So today I'm going to talk about what some of those steps are. And I'm just going to start with a pretty concise list of the things that I think it's really important to measure when you are building, deploying, updating, and improving a stream, not a stream, a chatbot. So first up, you want to make sure that you have, you have repeatable expected baseline behavior. So tests, your tests should always pass. You should have pretty good test coverage. I think any of y'all who've worked in software development for any length of time, you're familiar with this. I don't need to harp on it too much right now. Because machine learning models also have this ability to, guess guess and deal with new instances that they haven't seen before, you want to make sure that your machine learning model, which is making guesses, can guess well on data it hasn't seen before. So held out data or novel data, particularly because you can expect your assistant's language data that it sees to change over time. And I would call this generally model validation. And of course, if you've been working in machine learning for any length of time, this is also not a surprise to you. It's probably something you've done quite a bit. Another thing that you're going to want to measure, especially in a business setting, which I know the majority of you are building chatbots for business settings, is something specific to your application that lets you say, hey, this is what we wanted to do when we started this project, and here's the evidence that we are or aren't doing that thing. So a wide variety of things that you can measure here. Hi, Faiza, welcome. I know it's a little bit late for you, but glad you could make the stream. There's a wide variety of things that you could measure for a specific application, and what matters to you is going to depend on you and your team and the product you're building. But just some ideas, click-through rate. I really like time saved. So are you saving the user's time? Other KPIs, key performance indicators, and these are probably going to be set by somebody more, in touch with the business side of the team, maybe the product manager, somebody like that. Also, this is probably something that would be decided by more of a senior engineer on the team, feasibility. So let's say you have a working chatbot and you're like, I want to add a new conversational flow. And to add this conversational flow, you need to handle, 8 new intents that you don't have any training data for. Well, do you have the time to do that on your team right now? How much effort is it going to take? Is this something that's a task that you have somebody who has a lot of experience doing on your team, and it's not going to be a huge time sink for them because they know what they're doing? Or is this something that nobody on your team has done before and it's going to take a lot of time and effort to get up and running? Is your model very big? Is this going to add a lot of compute time? Compute costs money. Do you have the budget for it? Is there going to be a lot of support? So that might be, is it going to, create or increase or reduce the level of customer support? If it's a customer-facing bot, you need to provide from a human. Is it going to reduce it significantly enough that it makes sense to add the additional time and effort and compute? and how much support and maintenance is your team going to need to add. So something to think about before you are starting the project. Actually, I would start this thinking in the scoping project stage. And then finally, qualitative analysis. So this is more of difficult to measure, right? So qualitative just means you're not using numbers. It's not quantitative. And it's more about the quality of the conversations, the quality of the customer experience. How happy does this make people, right? That's pretty hard to quantify. How satisfying is it? Does it build your brand, right? That's not something that it's easy to quantify, but it's still important to think about. Uh, yeah, and I see that there's some questions. So I'm going to save some time for questions at the end for folks who are coming through and watching this a little bit later on. And I would generally refer, and this is just sort of my term, to these last three things, these application-specific measures of success or markers of success. Feasibility and qualitative analysis is evaluation, sort of generally. It's a little bit of a broad term, and again, it's just one that I'm using. And these are separate from your testing and your validation. But you do need all three, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each of these and sort of the process. So testing, you want tests for stable behavior. This is behavior that should always be the same. Like I mentioned, once a system is trained, a Rasa chatbot is trained, its behavior should be deterministic. So if you have the same conversation 2 times in a row, you should get the same output. So this is a way of making sure that that consistent expected behavior is observed. You want to do unit tests, which in the Rasa context is end-to-end stories, and integration tests. So having a way to test each of your channels that you're integrating with and making sure that your assistant is behaving as expected, that the conversation is rendering as expected. You might do some UI-based tests as well to make sure that everything looks the way that you expect it to look. And I already said what the chatbot example looks like, and y'all who've been working on Rasa projects for a while, you're very familiar with this. I don't think I need to go too deep into it. And then we have validation. So validation is different from testing. This is not making sure that you have an expected stable behavior. This is making sure that your assistant and the models that underlie your assistant are able to capture only the generalizable patterns that are existing in your training data and also show up in your test data and the data that your assistant sees once it's been deployed, right? So that's what I mean by generalizable, right? That it's not your assistant hasn't learned only the patterns that appear in your training data, and when it sees new patterns, it can't handle them, which we would call overfitting. Or your assistant also hasn't not learned those patterns, which is something we'd call underfitting, right? The assistant needs more time or more data in order to be able to make, again, these generalizable ideas. And if you've seen these learning curves over on that side, from your point of view, this is just from Wikipedia Commons. Usually what you want to do is you want to look for where the elbows sort of come together so that the training score and the cross-validation score are quite close to each other. And if you're looking at training or testing, you don't want to see something where the training score gets better and better and better and better, and the testing score gets worse and worse and worse and worse. So usually they'll converge, and then they might start to drift apart. The converging part is from underfitting to well-fitting, and then the drifting apart is from underfitting to overfitting, well-fitting to overfitting, rather. So the general idea here is this helps to evaluate how well your model can perform with new data. And you'll see a lot of sort of test training split and cross validations with your training data. You need to do that, right? That's absolutely important. But also your assistant, once it's in production, is going to see samples from a data, population that is changing over time. So you also want to make sure that your assistant can handle novel data. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about CDD a little bit later on, spoiler alert. But that's one way of making sure that, yeah, your model's still being a good model of the behavior you want to capture. That was extremely high level. There's a lot more to validation than that. But hopefully, if this is something that you're not familiar with, this gives you sort of an idea of the process. And if it's something you are familiar with, good little refresher. So I teased a little bit about the changes over time. So language changes, that's a constant. You can take it to the bank. Over time, language will change. Language use, even within an individual, will change. A great example of this is a new topic may pop up that's never popped up before. So, in the past couple of years, there's been a lot more people talking about, say, epidemiology than previously. So you've probably heard some, new words, learned some new terms, and they were not things that you were thinking about before. So in general, you want your validation data to match the distribution of the systems, match the distribution of the data your systems see in production. Which, I mean, if you have a system in production, good news, you have that data, which is good. And then finally, evaluation. And I talked about this a little bit before. It's all of those other things that we talked about. What will tell you that your system is working, what is telling you that your development process is working, all the other things besides testing repeatable behavior and validating the machine learning models. And it's really going to depend on what matters to you in your project. Get out of the way a little bit. Also, I really like this paper from 2017, which was a study that I read. I'm trying to remember when I read it. It might have been right after it came out because I thought it was really interesting. And basically, they looked at why do people use chatbots? When is the experience good? And the number one thing is if a chatbot saves you time, you tend to like it. If it doesn't, you get frustrated. So, oh, no, move me. There we go. So this has all been all pretty theoretical and high level. Let's talk a little bit more about what this looks like in action. And I did tease this a little bit earlier. Those of you who've been doing Rasa work for a while, no surprise. At Rasa, we recommend conversation-driven development. So if you're familiar with test-driven development, it's like that, except conversations. So the sort of general, very broad overview. Sorry, that pause was, I thought I had a picture here, but I guess I didn't. The sort of very general description of conversation-driven development is that you have human labelers and they're part of the deployment loop, right? They're going through, they're analyzing the output of the system, they are correcting or adding labels, and then that training data is being looped back into the training data for the assistant. It's being retrained and redeployed. This only works if you look at your data, and you do have to look at your data. And I am so sorry, but if you are building a language technology, period, you need to look at the data. As a technologist, there's really no getting around it. You can also think of it as CI/CD, which is continuous integration, continuous deployment. Sometimes I forget what the I stands for, but I'm pretty sure it's integration. But it also includes data labeling and retraining. So it's, CI/CD from a software engineering background, but it's adding this machine learning component for handling the data. And once more, you do have to look at your data, or at least somebody needs to, right? Somebody who has a good understanding of the expected behavior of whatever the system is. It's not just chatbots that this is true of. All right, here are the steps. In conversation-driven deployment, sharing, reviewing, annotating, testing, tracking, and fixing, we'll talk about all of them. So first off, sharing with users, with real human beings. And this doesn't mean that as soon as you have a prototype, you launch, right? It means that as soon as you have a prototype, you get it in front of actual people to see how they interact with the assistant. Because you as a developer are going to have a knowledge of the expected workflows that you think are going to happen, and B, a strong prior, right? You collated or annotated or worked with the training data, so you know what's in the training data, so you will be sort of biased towards saying things that are more like what's in the training data. That's not going to be true of the vast majority of people who are actually using your assistant. So seeing what people say when they're actually interacting with the assistant lets you sample from that population of things that people are going to say to your assistant once it's in production, if that makes sense. So as soon as possible, like if you can get a prototype up and running within a week, immediately sharing it, even with just people outside your team and your organization. So it's on this side, a little sort of sassy thing. It's never worked to ship without test users. You will discover something every time, and if you don't, you'll know about it. You'll be sad, we'll be sad, nobody will have a good time. And then reviewing. So I mentioned you can't get away from looking at your data. This is the stage when you look at your data, looking at the conversations, doing that qualitative analysis that I mentioned, just like what seems to be working, what seems not to be working. And this is just the Rasa X interface that I think some of you are probably familiar with. It's a tool that we built to help make annotation and reviewing and retraining easier. You could do it using other tools, but it's free, so feel free to use it. And then annotating. So you've looked at your data, you've been like, I think we're missing an intent. A bunch of people are trying to do X with my assistant. So I'm either going to, have a way to do X or have a response that I'm going to do when I start to see X. And I'm going to go through and label things as X and use that to train and redeploy my assistant. A note here, I get a lot of questions about generating training data. In general, I don't recommend this. There was actually a lot of research as well on using reinforcement learning to try and train assistants in the 2017, I think was the high watermark of that research program. Facebook did a lot of it. And yes, it trained assistants that could do the task when talking to another bot, but the language output was, shall we say, not human looking, right? It was not good examples of human language. I wouldn't recommend building a system this way. It's not a solved problem how to do it, and you're going to be frustrated, would be my guess. But like I mentioned, you have the data, especially if you've been sharing your assistant, you've been getting those reviewing conversations. Just use that. And then testing. I know we talked about this. I don't think you need a whole bunch of overview with it, especially the Rasa developers. Y'all are pretty experienced with software development. Write your tests. Eat your broccoli, write your tests, right? And then tracking. So this is where the evaluation would really come into play. What are the things that your team cares about? How well is the assistant doing in capturing that behavior or helping people to do the thing that you want them to do using the assistant? Negative signals can be helpful. So do people talk to the assistant and then their problems are solved and they don't get back in touch, right? One that I really like is if people have the choice between the assistant and your, human support network, do they tend to choose the assistant? So I think the T-Mobile assistant that Heather Nolis's team worked on it. There's a talk about it on the channel if you're curious. I think about 30% of the time users chose to use the assistant over talking to a person, presumably because they could get their work done faster. And I think that's really great signal, right? Are people choosing to use the chatbot? And then fixing, right? Fix what's not working, retest it, add intents, take intents away, add conversational flows. You might add, conditional response variables to handle some of the, reduce the number of stories you have to handle like common branches, that sorts of thing. This is really, this is a big part of the work, and I don't want to downplay that. But I think it's one that also a lot of Rasa developers feel pretty confident doing. And, the software development process is gonna be a little wibbly wobbly. You're gonna go back and forth. It's gonna take iteration. It's gonna take time. But, every time you review and annotate and make a fix and then test and then redeploy and then have more people test it and then re-annotate, you're going to have an assistant that can better and better and better and better capture what it's actually seeing, the behavior you're actually seeing people have with the assistant, rather than the behavior that you thought they might have had in the first place when you were in the design phase. And often those things are pretty separate. So at this point, if you haven't been working in this process before, you might feel a little bit tired. It is a lot of work. But as chatbot developers, I certainly I wasn't developing chatbots at the time, but I certainly remember sort of the circa 2016 hype era where everyone was really excited about chatbots, and then people went and used chatbots and it didn't work very good, and it was very frustrating. So if you're taking shortcuts, it might work for like a very, very simple system, but if you want a robust system that can handle conversations in a natural way, you gotta look at what people are saying and adapt your assistant to better handle that. And as a final thing, just to think about before we move on to the Q&A, language technology is always going to be compared to human language use, right? If I have a conversational interface, I am putting it in front of people who know how to have a conversation and know how to have a conversation with a fluent interlocutor, right? Somebody that they can talk to and have that natural flow, and they have extremely strong expectations and intuitions about how that's going to go and how it should go. That's going to be, culturally bounded. It's going to be language bounded. There are very strong things that people are coming into any conversation expecting to see. And that's where we need to be if these systems are going to really genuinely meet that bar of expectations. But I guess the flip side of that is that it's not very glamorous. So sort of like the pipes, if you have a conversation, an interaction with a chatbot that goes really naturally, really frictionless, really fast, probably no one's going to mention it because it met their expectations. They did what they needed to do. It was super frictionless and they had a good time. Which I know, that can be maybe a little bit disheartening. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I tend to think of, what mature machine learning will look like as a discipline, sort of like, civil engineering. It's not maybe the most glamorous discipline, but genuinely can help people, particularly if you're taking safety and people's needs into consideration. So, anyway, that's my little high horse that I will get off of. And now we got time for questions. And I see that there's a bunch in the chat, so let me look at that also. That's gonna bother me forever. Sorry, there's a little sliver of pink beside the purple. There we go. I fixed it. All right. Beza says, can you explain something to me? Is Rasa an NLP framework? When was it created? Was it created using some NLP models, and then the models were also created by the team? Great question. So Rasa is an NLP. Rasa is a chatbot framework and purposefully designed to be modular so that you could bring your own NLP. We have built as a team NLP components that are chatbot specific. So diet, as an example, to identify entities and intents. That's a chatbot specific task. TED to do dialogue policy, be a dialogue policy, I guess, to decide what the next turn should be. That's a chatbot specific task. We've changed a little bit over the versions, what the sort of the defaults are. It was only with 2.0 that we provided a default baseline pipeline for everybody. So I believe, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what's in our default pipeline. We integrate with a lot of NLP libraries. So Spacey is another one that's out of Explosion AI, which is a fabulous company. Everyone that works there, I really like. And they do open source NLP pipelines in Python. They also have a lot of open source language models. We also integrate with a lot of the Hugging Face models. So Hugging Face is an NLP startup from the US, and they have a wide variety of models available. And just like, I don't know, Hugging Face they're always doing something. And every time I learn about a new Hugging Face thing, I'm like, oh, I didn't see that coming. Okay. I would say that they surprised me quite a bit. We also integrate with things like Mighty, which was developed at MIT. So the sort of very low level, or Fast Text, which I believe is a Facebook project. So the very low level NLP things that you would use across projects, we don't usually build. But the specific parts that you need for a chatbot, we usually build and open source. So hopefully that answers it. And then all the things that I mentioned are open sourced as well. All right. Faisa says, people always ask me what NLP model Rasa uses for the framework. I'm confused to say Rasa uses this kind of NLP model or whatever. They have their own NLP model for creating the Rasa framework. Yeah. Yeah, hopefully that more or less answered it. I would say that Rasa is, what I like to say is, we are human language agnostic, which also means that we do that by being modular. So you can take any NLP model that you like and put it into your pipeline. Samir says, would you please talk about deployment? Do you have any specific questions around deployment? I will say that generally we recommend using Kubernetes or Kubernetes, depending on your preferred pronunciation or some other sort of containerized deployment structure. We have, K8s. We have Helm charts is the word I was looking for. I was like, K8s, that is Kubernetes. We also have Helm charts that we've sort of pre-written in open source to help you with the deployment process. But depending on what your backend looks like, it might look quite different, particularly if you have a very large or very complex use case. You might need, a different tracker store, for example, or you might have, an action server that has a lot of additional dependencies that you need to handle elsewhere. So it depends, is what I would generally say about deployment. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm not entirely sure what you needed to know. What are the algorithms used behind the platform? So as I mentioned, we're very modular. If you choose, you can use any algorithms that you like. The specific algorithms that we have developed in-house, and again, we've published the research, it's open source, you're free to dig into it. And also Vincent has some really nice videos about it as well on the channel. The big two are diet, which is the intent and entity extraction that's transformer based. It's multitask learning, so it does both of them at the same time. A little caveat, if you're using TensorFlow 2.6, I would go read the blog post / watch the video I did with Felicia to talk a little bit more in depth about how the 2.6 update affects diet specifically. And then Transformer is a TED is a transformer-based dialogue policy, which we, again, developed in-house, open sourced. So yeah, if you're talking about very generally what sort of frameworks we use under the hood, a lot of transformers, particularly for this sort of long-range dependencies, it makes a lot of sense. Another policy, I believe it's experimental currently, is unexpected, and this is a dialogue policy that flags turns that are surprising. So that's also I believe it's an experimental, so we're working on, additional stuff with it. But that's another example of an algorithm that we've developed in-house. Hopefully that answers your question, Abdel. Feel free to clarify if that wasn't quite enough information. All right. Henderman says, good talk. How do these relate? Conditional response variables, two-stage fallback, and custom utterances. Forms can be used to confirm data from the utterances. From the user, utterances seem to be inflexible. Sorry, typing from phone. Oh, no worries. My friends are very used to unscrambling my typing from my phone, which is bad. So, a couple different questions is, I'm just going to talk about these one by one, just to make sure we're on the same page. So conditional response variables don't change the dialogue policy, but at a certain point, when you are picking a response, you can change the response based on a slot beyond just replacing the slot with the value of the slot. So a good example of this would be like, hello, username, welcome back. So instead of just having one utterance where you replace username with the actual username, you can have multiple utterances based on the value of the slot and pick it that way. So you might have, let's say, if it's the first turn of conversation, you might have, let's say, a slot that says customer loyalty level. And if it's the highest loyalty level, you're like, effusive greetings. We're delighted to see you. Golden crown emoji. And if they're the lowest customer loyalty level, you might be like, hey, nice to have you. What can we help you with? That sort of thing. I don't know. It's a little bit of a weird example, but you sort of get what I mean. Two-stage fallback. I would have to, it's been a while since I have looked into what two-stage fallback looks like now. I feel like it might be deprecated. Let me double check. But basically the general idea of a fallback policy is when you have a turn. So sorry, I'm backing up to the appropriate place in the process where this is relevant. So the fallback policy triggers when the confidence of a model guess basically is too low and you set that threshold. And the place that this can fail is I'm not entirely sure I know what the user tried to say. So my guess of the intent has a low fallback. And then the second thing it can be is like, I know what the user tried to say, I don't know what to do next. So the dialogue policies all have pretty low confidence. And I'm in the docs right now and I'm just looking up two-stage. Default, okay, two-stage fallback. I don't think if I drag this over, you will see it. Yeah, you don't, but I do. It's on top of my thing. So I'm just gonna drag it over here so I'm looking in the right direction. Okay, excellent. So it is not deprecated. Good. I just wanted to double check. So basically the two-stage fallback policy is like, hey, if something happens where my bot's not sure what to do next, you have the opportunity to ask for more information, at which point, based on what happens, then you can decide what to do next. So that's instead of a one-stage fallback where if you're like, hey, if my confidence is ever low, regardless of whether that comes from the intent or what to do next, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I'm confused. Do you want to do one of these things? And then provide some buttons, right? So that's sort of the difference there. And then custom utterance forms can be used to confirm data from the user. Custom utterance, is that something specific? I'm just looking in the docs right now. Another utter custom JSON. I'm in the change logs now. It's utter custom. When using the Telegram channel, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by custom utterances. Yeah. And then the last one was forms can be used to confirm the data from the user. Utterances seem to be inflexible. Yes. So I think there's a couple of questions here. So one, we just sort of talked about all of the different things that you mentioned. Yes, by default, you would handwrite your utterances, and the way that they would be selected would be with your dialog policy, with your custom response variables in an action. I think that's what you mean by custom utterances, or potentially as part of the fallback policy. If you wanted to generate utterances, it's definitely possible. Again, we're open source. You're definitely free to tinker. I would put up like a little warning sign around doing generation besides something like slot filling or conditional response variables to change it based on the slot. Just because there is room for things to get maybe more exciting than you want them to be in terms of what your users see from your bot, if that makes sense. Natural language generation is very difficult, it's very complex, and messing it up, especially in the context of an assistant that is, representing the brand of a company, can be kind of high stakes. So yes, very possible to do more language generation or natural language generation (NLG) in the process of your bot serving utterances. Tread with caution, sort of generally. Yeah, in the custom action. Okay, yeah. Okay, excellent. I think we're on the same page there. Yeah. I guess it would be helpful for me to get a better understanding of what sort of utterances you want to happen that are custom to the user. Sorry, that face is me thinking about specific instances that I have run into where people want to do that. And Lemon says more exciting than I want. Yeah. I would say in general that is the case. That said, technically template filling is or using templates is a type of natural language generation. So that's the like slot filling that I mentioned. Yeah. The other thing you might do in that state where you want more and